So in New York, a charter school is its own not-for-profit education corporation, which is formed when the charter is approved. As I had a discussion with Audrey once, it springs into existence once the charter is approved. Each charter school is also its own local educational agency for purposes of federal law and for purposes of state and federal accountability, like NCLB and SURE school status. Only the Education Corporation in New York can hold the charter. That is its board of trustees. No not-for-profit corporation, partner organization, CMO, EMO, any other of the alphabet soup of charter school entities can hold the charter in New York. Also, all the charters are limited both in their initial term and in renewal to a 5-year charter term. If you turn to your folders, you'll see a one-page handout called Definition of Terms. It looks like this. It's a very important sheet for the following reason. We're going to try to speak the common language here today because I know we've been throwing out a lot of terms and there's always a lot of different lingo in charter land. But we'd like to keep people on the same page so that later on, when we have the notes and we move toward policy, at least SUNY will be able to sort of divine what it was that went on in some of the conference sessions. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time since you have it there. We've already discussed an education corporation. One important piece about an ed corp in New York, in these charter schools, is that they are self-selecting boards. In other words, although the board may be approved in the beginning, and authorizers may look at the individual trustees that go on a school board, the school boards are self-selecting. They elect their own. They may have representative seats, but they determine who is on the school board ultimately. A school is an important term in the multi-site or replication area. It is really the vehicle for delivering a complete educational program. It has its own students, it has independent leadership, it has dedicated staff and defined facilities. It could also be housed in more than one site, which I'll talk about in a minute. And importantly, for purposes of the grant that we really thank SED for helping us attain in New York, a school would qualify for charter school program funding. A site, on the other hand, would not qualify for charter school program funding. A site is simply a place where you may have students from a school that does not operate on its own. It is part of a broader LEA. It is part of a different accountability system attached to something else. So when we talk about multi-site generally, which I'll get to, a site is not a school in our lingo. It's only a place where students happen to be. We're going to discuss later mergers or consolidations. And basically, since we're talking about education corporations as the unit that controls schools, it would make sense to have mergers or consolidations as one of the options available under a multi-site environment. A merger is where you have two education corporations come together and form another education corporation, and the successor corporation is one of the original ones. Consolidation, you have two education corporations come together. If you look in the picture later, you'll see, and you have a new education corporation. Multi-site, again, we're using as a general term. It refer to any number of school and or governance combinations, including a single education corporation operating multiple schools, multiple education corporations, as Julie Butcher mentioned, the ICON system, multiple education corporations operating multiple schools, formally only allowed to be one-to-one. Replication is a more specific term where we're really talking about the ed program in one school, the policies, practices, procedures being replicated, being duplicated in another school. That is what we're going to refer to as replication, a more specific term. It is also what we're referring to generally is what authorizers do, their processes, their systems, their policies to replicate high-performing schools. And again, it would be helpful if everyone tried to use these terms during the conference so that when the notes are distilled, we can really use that directly toward our policy discussions later. Okay, so prior to the amendments, Charter Schools Act of 2010, the charter only permitted one education corporation to have one school. So it was always one-to-one, right? It didn't have to be one site, but only one school. SUNY's renewal practices, therefore, combine the legal requirements of charter renewal, which is sort of the corporate charter renewal, with the review functions of the education corporation and a high-stakes academic review to determine whether or not a school should be closed, whether or not it should be renewed, and then for how long. The practice came about because we only had one school, we had one charter term, and at the end of that term, we had to establish a new term and then have a new renewal. You can think about when there's a possibility of more than one school, we can break out of always looking at the corporation and looking at the school, especially if it's more than one school, at the same time. We have the ability to go from looking at the corporation and its corporate life and looking at the schools underneath on two separate tracks. And again, emphasize, we don't have the answers here, but we sense the possibilities here. It's within this framework that SUNY and our fellow authorizers have replicated successful schools to date, largely one at a time, using the same resources, the same methods, and although we have, I wouldn't say cut corners, we've smartly done it, it is still a very labor and time and resource intensive process. Needing keep up. So needing a separate education corporation for each replicated school is a model with some advantages and many disadvantages. On the positive side, a separate education corporation can serve generally as a financial and liability firewall. So, for example, if there's a slip and fall at one school that exceeds the levels of insurance, it doesn't affect any other school. The school may go bankrupt, the school may close, but it doesn't drag down a network of schools. When schools are linked between each other, and some are already linking by contract in many ways, that insulation of the corporate form is not there to protect the charter schools anymore. There are also some economies of scale that can be realized between schools of separate entities, separate education corporations. You can order books en masse, you can have service contracts en masse. The problem is each and every one of those transactions has to be detailed separately on each book, each set of books of each school, and it sometimes frustrates what the founders are trying to do with the multiple schools. But for the reasons I mentioned, some operators prefer to replicate through separate education corporations, and SUNY is going to continue to permit that and encourage that if that is what these operators want to do. Of course, we want to try to do it in a more streamlined manner, where we save resources, where we don't look at the curriculum, as Jim mentioned, for the 16th time, because we saw it 15 times before. We may even refer to it by reference and not actually bring it in to the paperwork. But let's talk about the significant facilities, structural governance limitations of replication prior to the 2010 amendments to the Charter Schools Act. So each school, each individual school with each education corporation on top of it is subject to the same layers of oversight review by both the authorizer and the Board of Regents. Each school has to also deal with multiple corporate requirements. We talked about having independent boards with multiple members. SUNY has permitted the same board, but they all wear multiple hats and have multiple duties of loyalty to multiple schools, multiple duties of financial fidelity to each one of the schools, and then come the multiple notices, the multiple meetings, the multiple reports to multiple entities. And it all becomes a little bit maddening for both the authorizer and I'm sure for the schools, and we've heard from many of those schools about this many times in the past. As a result, the economies of scale, which you think would be realized by having a number of education corporations running a number of schools, really get a little bit frustrated. And we talk about the need for documentation of all these transactions on the fiscal side. So charter schools cannot be arranged like districts in New York. This was mentioned by Jim. We can't have the feeder schools that feed up, as Massachusetts is now doing and some of the other states are now doing. And this has been a very large source of frustration, especially at the high school level, because the districts can take all those kids at the bottom and pyramid up to a high school, and high school being a more expensive version of education, they can help pay for that. A standalone charter high school is a very expensive proposition in many cases, and it's not been allowed under the Act. We've gotten around that in New York by taking a high school and calling it one high school, actually being 4 separate legal entities operating one high school, where all the services are shared, all the costs are shared. In theory, the teachers are getting paid by 4 entities. It may look like a high school, but legally it's 4 schools operating a joint program. And any time one of those schools might leave, which is legally permissible, it could affect the whole. So this notion that having the feeder schools is a good idea, we've worked on that, but 2 big limitations. One, all the excess contracting and work around not being able to do it under the Act. And two, you still cannot have the students at the elementary and middle schools feed into a central high school because they don't have the returning student preference in New York. In New York, all admissions are by lottery except the returning student preference, community school district preference, and if we get into the at-risk designations. But the key factor is you can't just feed the schools in unless they're under one corporation. So, one of the other big challenges that charter schools are often criticized, and I see Dr. McGarrett left, and he's spoken about this. Oh, he's come back, okay. He's spoken about this consistently. Charter schools are having difficulty serving special ed students, especially in the ends of the spectrum where it's more resource intensive, where you've got the 12-1-1s, the 8-1-1s, the one-to-one paras, where you're having a number of students that need to be in one room, and we can also include probably English language learners, although there's far more flexibility under state and federal law to serve English language learners. They have difficulty serving those populations because they don't have the economies of scale. They can't pool up the kids the way that districts are able to do that. And this has been a large source of frustration for many people. Many people are not in favor of charter schools. We've now acquired targets in New York for English language learners, special education students, and students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch. The latter category really not much of a concern for most charters. But this issue may be something that's very soluble if we can allow schools to pool students together and then transfer those students, which right now, even schools under sort of common governance, so the same individual serving as 5 boards can't transfer students between schools, even for special ed or for English, well maybe for English language learners, but largely not. So a challenge that we've thought about at SUNY in making schools look like districts is we don't want charter schools to repeat the problems that districts have had. So that's a big challenge. How do we allow schools the flexibility to arrange themselves more like districts without inheriting the problems to the educational programs that we've seen in districts and the excess bureaucracy? So this language in green up there is sort of the magic amendments to the Charter Schools Act. Maybe a good third grade class could have come up with that at one of the charter schools, but our legislature did put that into the law 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning. So we live with it, and we think about what can we do with it, right? And there's a lot of things we think we can do with it, including, most importantly, an education corporation operating more than one school. And that is the sort of watershed moment and why we're having this, really having this conference. There is a price. Each new school is going to burn a charter off the cap. Not with the mergers, but every time a new school comes into existence, an existing corporation adds one on, it's going to burn the charter off the cap. And we don't have to get into sort of the real details of that and what it might mean in terms of New York City, which has a sub-cap under the law of 57 schools from each authorizer that's allowed to do RFPs. But that is a real cost that we think about. And so even though we're talking about replication, we're talking about multi-site, let's not lose sight of the fact that charters are still a scarce resource in New York. They are not like, as one of my former bosses used to say, like water. The changes, though, will allow SUNY to provide more high-quality charter school seats under the revised law and new pathways to do so and try to be efficient about it. One of the things about one-to-one authorizing is it is inefficient. We ask for the same paper. We have the same reviews. We have the same panels. We have the same interview process. And although we're changing that, and I think foreshadowing what Jason's going to talk about later, we have to really rev that up so we can spend more time on innovation, on the mom and pops, on the new models, on blended learning, distance learning, on things that we have not jumped in with 2 feet in the way that we're trying to jump into replication. So the challenge here is to do it in a way that ensures quality, to not grant more charters than existing schools and their human and fiscal resources can handle, and to keep the collective risk of school failure low. SUNY has about a 10% failure rate. We've authorized 101 schools, and we've closed or restructured 9. So with replication schools, I think we hope to see that be a much lower number. I would shoot for not only half of that, but hopefully only 1% failure rate on replication schools. If we're not doing that, if we're just putting charters on the street, letting 1,000 flower bloom, if I was doomed and they all die, that's not a very efficient way to get more high quality seats in New York, right? We want high quality seats, we want them to stay, we want them to be renewed. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a foundation, getting off the law there. to some of the possibilities. And the reason I use that word is our former executive director, Jonah Shottuck, said, you have to have a sense of possibility around authorizing. And I think we share that when it comes to replication and multi-site charters. So I discussed before briefly, one possibility here is merger. Mergers or consolidations of existing education corporations would now be possible because one education corporation can operate more than one school, and if it so happens that that school is an existing school, SUNY's going to say we can do that. We can have such a merger. We would go on to say that we believe it can be accomplished through a revision to each school's charter, so have a streamlined process, and that they can either have one of the existing corporations be the successor corporation, or a brand new one be the successor corporation, and not that. Another, taking this a step further, we see no legal prohibition on why charter schools under different authorizers can't merge together and essentially choose the authorizer, which is the successor authorizer. So if we're doing this by revision, we need a revision of each school, and then each school's authorizer would have to approve the transaction, and for any authorizer other than SUNY, the Board of Regents would have to approve that revision. That would allow schools who for some reason are unhappy with SUNY to flee SUNY and go to another authorizer, and vice versa. It opens up yet another series of possibilities. It also allows networks that have arranged themselves under multiple authorizers to come under one or another authorizer for efficiency, not be dealing with two different sets of evaluations, two different sets of paperwork, two different types of charter agreement. So I think we can wring an efficiency, an easy efficiency, by allowing schools to merge, especially if they merge across authorizers. And again, although I'm a lawyer and I'm talking about the law, you can see I'm staying general, the legal niceties of how we get there on merger on any of these issues are not what's important. And one of the other reasons we talk about merger is the result of the merged corporation will be a multi-site charter school, just like the other ones that we're about to do. Okay, so the big possibility here, one education corporation operating multiple schools. We also at SUNY envision this being done by way of basically a new school application, streamlined we hope, that would come in and revise an existing charter, and as we sort of say in the language, and hang another charter off the existing ed corp. We'd amend the corporate paperwork to say this particular ed corp can operate 2 schools, 3 schools, 4 schools, 5 schools, each time burning a charter, and each time going through a review process we envision of some type, although that may be up for grabs in this conference as well. The charter agreement would have to be revised, and I think we're open to, in some way, we're open to having multiple charter agreements, we're open to having maybe exhibits to existing charter agreements, but there would be some legal construct that defines the parameters of what each school would be, have to do, including accountability, oversight, policies and procedures, that sort of thing. And that may be a little bit distinct from what we do in the General Education Corporation, so that's a big lift for us tomorrow on the legal sections. Feeder school models, which have been mentioned, and I've mentioned, very important, a huge demand for this. One board of trustees governing one ed corp, multiple elementary schools, fewer middle schools, and fewer high schools, typically shown as a pyramid, not here with just one high school at the top. We can envision building level governance for these schools. We're going to have that board of ed, or board of trustees of a charter school at the top, but each other school may have its own local governance. It could be committees of the board. It could be a lot of other models that are set up. However, in keeping the SUNY's commitment to autonomy in charter schools, we are not going to dictate what that local level of governance or even the overall governance structure should look like. I think what we're going to do is react to what the market brings us, react to what the operators want to do, and then we have to figure out what's the best way to oversee that and work within that framework. Another possibility, which we mentioned before, multiple related education corporations operating multiple schools. So while this is available now on a one-to-one basis, one ed corp, one school, we could have 5 or 6 related ed corps operating 2 or 3 schools each, all in a loose network of some type with common themes, common policies, common procedures, common funding, philanthropic funding, other funding. Another possibility here, and a hybrid of what's available now. We're also thinking ahead, and that we're not limited really by the Charter Schools Act as it was before. It may be that when a charter school can operate another school, it can maintain the corporate structure of the original school, like a wholly owned subsidiary, for example. And so these are just some of the ideas we've thought about and haven't all the way fleshed in yet, but we don't want to prejudice any arrangements to deliver high-quality educational services to students. Our challenge is going to be assess the viability, the human capacity, the fiscal capacity to actually put these structures into place. Toward the end of our sense of possibility here is we're always talking about, it seems, and the law is written this way if you look back at the law page, that an existing education corporation would operate multiple schools. What about the people who want to come in the door and say, we want to be a multi-site charter school network, even though we haven't even given you an application yet? SUNY is willing to entertain this. We've entertained it before. It's how we've done all the replication schools you have now, but we did them one ed corporate at a time. There's really no reason, short of having to maybe grant a charter and then sort of merge something, while we can't let networks like Rhodes or New Vision's charter schools, which are new to SUNY, come in the door that way. The difference may be we have to spend a lot more time on the front end assessing legal capacity, fiscal capacity, understanding what this network would look like in its infancy, looking forward, maybe where to put the brakes on. But we don't see it as something that is prohibited by the Charter Schools Act. So that really brings us to some of the challenges, which I know were fleshed out already here at the conference. I won't dwell on those. But of the legal challenges, the real challenge isn't how far to take replication. We can bend and stretch the law in many ways, and we may wind up in court. We may wind up having bitter disputes with some other authorizers. You never know what might happen. But that's not what we're here to talk about, right? What we're here to talk about is how far should we take it? Where is the best place to take the law, to take what's allowed under the law, and decide this is what we want to do, and then what lawyers always do, because we're kind of like the Sankofa, right? We look backward, is then figure out how we're going to write it up after the fact. So that is the biggest challenge, and I think should be the focus of the conference is where do we find the best place to take the law to ensure we're being responsive to the demands of the schools, the networks, and at the same time fulfill what was mentioned before, our obligation as an overseer, as somebody who is a steward of public and private funds that flow into charter schools. So on a final note, while I want to give you a briefing, and obviously very brief and not too detailed, on the law in New York to help guide our conversation over the next day or two here, I think many of the issues we'll be tackling will be applicable to our other authorizing friends, as well as people from across the country who are considering replication and continue to consider replication. We are not here at SUNY inventing the wheel. We aren't pretending to. And we also are definitely committed to working with NACSA and thank them for the grant to share what comes out of this conference and then to share any principles, policies, practices that we wring out of all this process and define down the road later on. I'm sure we'll be revisiting replication. So I want to thank them again and hope that the others in the room can use what we find, and we're always willing to help, to meet the particular needs of your state.